Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, we are talking about the gut behavior connection. Specifically, we're going to talk about the gut microbiome, the colonies of bacteria and other organisms in our gut, and how this impacts our brain and behavior. Now, I know that this is a topic that some of you may have looked into already. You may be using gut kinds of treatments with your child. And for some of you, this may be new information and you've maybe not considered before or learned about how what's going on in your child's gut and specifically in their gut microbiome is impacting their brain function and behavior. So it's a huge issue that I see in my clinical practice with kids and adults. And the cool thing is when you understand what's going on in terms of that gut-brain connection and that gut microbiome connection, there are some really great solutions that we can use that can have a really positive impact on symptoms like behavior, mood, anxiety, learning, those kinds of things. So I'm excited to have Kiran Krishnan as my guest today to talk about this. He's one of the most knowledgeable people I know in this field when it comes to talking about the gut microbiome. Kiran is a research microbiologist and has been involved in the dietary supplement and nutrition industry for the past 18 years. He comes from a strict research background, having spent several years with hands-on research and development in the fields of molecular medicine and microbiology. He's established a clinical research organization where he has designed and conducted dozens of human clinical trials in human nutrition, and is a co-founder and chief scientific officer at Microbiome Labs, and he's developed over 50 private label nutrition products throughout his career. Kiran lectures frequently on topics like the human microbiome at medical and nutrition conferences. He has a popular microbiome series educational webinar and is a guest expert on radio and all kinds of media. And he's currently involved in 10 novel human clinical trials on probiotics and the human microbiome. Kiran, you've got your hand in like everything related to the gut microbiome in this field. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. Yes, so we do find our ways to stay busy. And I have a microbiome constitution that makes me want to keep going out there and doing stuff. So, but you know, what's so important about it is all of this stuff is so relevant and it's so new.
Yeah.
We're just now starting to understand how the human body works, which is so amazing, right? I mean, we think about the thousands of years of evolution that we've had, millions of years of evolution, hundreds of years of medical research and science, you know, all the way from the days of Hippocrates. And then now we come back full circle to understanding that, you know, it's this ecology that we have in us that really controls everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that it's really fascinating, and we now understand disease process much better.
It's so true, and this is such an emerging field. You know, 10 years ago, there was some talk about the gut microbiome. When I first started working with kids and doing this kind of work, you know, more than 20 years ago, nobody was talking about this stuff. And the people who were, it was considered kind of fringy, right? And now we fast forward to today, and this is a just booming era of research on this, and so much more that we're understanding about specifically this gut-brain connection. I mean, how much gut health and the gut microbiome influences our health overall, but specifically how it impacts our brain. And, you know, many times when I introduce this idea to parents, they're like, well, I don't get it. You know, you're talking about things going on with, you know, how my child is digesting food and what's going on, you know, with their allergies and their bowel movements and all of that. But I'm here because my kid has anxiety or my kid is melting down and throwing tantrums all the time. Like, how are these connected? And really educating people about how much, as you said, there are these control mechanisms between the gut and the brain, and how impactful they are on one another. So I'd love to start out by having you give sort of an introduction to that. Why are we talking about gut bacteria in relation to behavior? What's the connection and the linkage there?
Yeah, so it's important to understand for your audience what role the gut bacteria plays in our overall day-to-day function to begin with, right? So we've got somewhere around 10 trillion cells that make up the human body. We've got over 100 trillion bacteria cells in our system. So we're outnumbered 10 to 1 just on cell count alone. And then the even more profound side of it is our DNA. You know, we think we're really cool, right? We're the top of the food chain. We're top of the evolutionary ladder. and yet we've only got about 22,000 functional genes. And that sounds like a lot, but then when you compare it to like a rice plant or an earthworm, these really primitive things that we think of, they have twice as many functional genes as the human system does. Right, so imagine a rice plant has like 38,000 functional genes, and we only have 22,000. So then the question is, how is it that we are at the top of the food chain, top of the evolutionary ladder? Well, it's because we have about 3.5 million bacterial genes in our system that we use every day for normal human function. You know, we would cease to exist if we didn't have all of that code, all of that information, all of the things that they produce. And in fact, to a point where the best estimates are around 90% of all of our day-to-day metabolic biochemical functions, just to be a human, come from bacteria. Right, so that's how impactful they are. Now, they also have a direct connection to our brain. You know, something called the vagus nerve, which connects the gut directly to the brain, and it allows bacteria in your gut, which is where the vast majority of bacteria that live in and on your body are. It allows those bacteria to actually send signals like neurotransmitters and peptides and all these things that can affect how the human host is behaving, how the human host perceives the world around them, how the human host deals with stress. All of those things are intimately affected by those bacteria sitting in your gut and sending these signals up and down. It's also really important to note that, you know, we know, and we've known for a while, that neurotransmitters in humans affect our behavior, right? The happy hormones like serotonin and dopamine, and then the stress hormones like cortisol and so on, all of those things affect our behavior, our mood, our function. It's also, with that in mind, it's important to note that the microbiome, so the collection of organisms in our gut, they produce all of those hormones. And in fact, there's evidence that shows that, in fact, our cells learned how to produce those hormones from the bacteria, right? So they were making them first. And then as a host, we started incorporating those hormones into our own communication systems. And then we started taking from the bacteria the codes to produce those hormones in our own organs. You know, but there are good studies that show that still we depend on microbially derived hormones for a lot of our function. You know, and so they control everything. I mean, we're really kind of a walking, talking rainforest. They are the puppet masters in many ways. We are the puppet. You know, and we need to understand them to figure out how to fix this broken puppet.
That's a great way of thinking about it, that we tend to think that, oh, we're at the top of the evolutionary chain, like we're in control of all this. And yet what you're saying and what we know from the research is all of these lower level organisms really play such a big role. And I think that it's easy for us to take it for granted when that whole system is working well, right? And this is why we tend not to recognize the connection between these things, because when we're functioning well and when we're feeling good, we don't think about, you know, our microbiome. We just take for granted that all that works. And then when we start to have issues, or our kids start to have issues, and we start to peel back the layers and look at that, suddenly we become so aware of the role that that microbiome is playing, and more specifically, what can happen for us symptom-wise when there are problems with that gut microbiome. And, you know, many of the kids that I see have both physical symptoms, even gut level symptoms, you know, constipation, diarrhea, bloating, you know, food allergies, that kind of stuff. And they're having what we would consider more brain types of symptoms, right? Like maybe depression, anxiety, behavior issues, those types of things. But I also see kids and young adults who don't report any GI types of symptoms. You know, they're not having any issues with bowel movements. They're not having issues with food, none of that. They're having more of, you know, those mental health symptoms. But still, what you're saying is the gut is still an important area to look at, and that microbiome is still part of that picture, even when a person isn't having, you know, those GI kinds of symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there in the microbiome, in terms of how it can impact your mood or your behavior, there's finite balances within there. So there are organisms within your microbiome itself that can increase heighten anxiety and increase stress levels. There are organisms that can make you calmer. They both exist and coexist in the microbiome. It's really in terms of what you experience, it depends on their balance at the moment, right? So a single course of antibiotics, for example, can throw off the balance and in fact cause a heightened sense of anxiety. Like one of the side effects of the fluoroquinolone antibiotics, one of the common side effects is heightened anxiety, right? And so, people wonder, well, how is it an antibiotic can give you anxiety? People can associate an antibiotic with diarrhea and things like that. But the reason it can give you an anxiety is because it increases the growth of the particular strains that cause that anxious response. And it can significantly decrease the growth of the strains that cause more calming responses. And the reason why these bacteria even have these effects in the body are mixed. Some of them are a side effect of what they're producing. So there are certain organisms that produce lots of serotonin. In fact, 95% of serotonin in the body is produced in the gut itself. There's lots of organisms produce high levels of dopamine. Now, they're not necessarily producing it for the host. They're not going, I know you need this host, so I'm producing this for you. They are producing it for their own benefit, and then we happen to be able to use some of it as well because it's within our system. Now, if that bacteria's metabolism is low, if they're harmed in some way, then the serotonin production goes down. In the same way with the bacteria that produce more stress hormones, they can do that if their levels go up. So it's really an ecology, and it's about balancing that ecology. And a lot of times, a sign of the imbalance would be the GI symptoms. But again, the imbalance in the ecology may not necessarily lead to GI symptoms. It might lead to behavioral issues, but then other things like seasonal allergies, or it might lead to rapid hair loss. It might lead to sleep issues. Those are other things that can also manifest themselves outside of the specific GI issues. But at the end of the day, one of the things we know of with fairly good certainty these days is that the microbiome is playing a significant role in all of these things. And if you're continuously trying to treat behavior issues with focusing on the brain, and you're not thinking about the gut that's controlling a lot of how the brain functions, then we're missing a big part of success.
I think that's so true. And even that mirrors my clinical journey too, of, going through all of my education in the realm of psychology, special education, those kinds of things. It was all brain oriented, right? These are the things that we do. And it was really in doing that with kids and realizing, wait a second, lots of kids aren't consistently getting better, or things aren't sticking. Like there's got to be more layers. So that's really what got me interested in the whole realm of nutrition and, functional medicine and gut microbiome and all of that, because I just saw that just, addressing this problem from a brain level perspective just wasn't getting where we needed to get for many kids.
Yeah, and we see, for example, the use of SSRIs, right? The success rate of SSRIs are really poor.
Yep.
Success rate of anti-anxiety medications are really poor. And then, so number one, why is it that those medications don't work as well as you think they should? And then number two, why is it that we're having so much anxiety and stress and depression in society today, right? I mean, of course, anytime you watch the news, it can be depressing. We all know that, right? But why is it that we haven't been able to deal with the stresses of life the same way that people a few generations ago did? Arguably, they had it even worse, right? When it comes to economics and politics and world wars and all that stuff going on. So a lot of it can be tied back to a pattern of destruction of our gut microbiome. So what we've done is we've evolved as this really intricate ecology of a species, right? We are a walking, talking rainforest. We are predominated by bacteria. We also require them to function on a day-to-day basis. So we've taken this construct that is an intimate ecology made up of a lot of bacteria that have to work in harmony, and we've put that construct in an antibacterial world, right? Everything around us is antibacterial. More than 50% of antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary, even according to the CDC. We've got fluoride in our drinking water, chlorine in our drinking water. We've got pesticides and herbicides all over our food products. Everything around us kills bacteria. And as we go down this road, as we keep killing our own ecology, we're going to see more and more of these problems pop up. A lot of people always ask me, how come we didn't have this much autism, 40 years ago? How come we didn't have gluten sensitivity at the same rates? How come we didn't have allergies? Now every school has severe peanut allergy students in there. So all of this stuff ties back to the same issue of disrupting our ecology. So what we can do as individuals is understand what that issue is, and then empower ourselves to fix those for ourselves and our family.
And I think that, you're touching on something that I think is good for people to understand, which is how is it that our gut microbiomes can get so out of balance in the first place? You talked about how that balance of organisms and the balance of them working together is so important. And what you're saying is, historically, as things have changed in the environment, our exposure to toxins, all of the things that kill bacteria. I know antibiotics use is a big one for a lot of the kids and the families that I see. When I look back and I start asking questions about their early health history, many of these kids were kids who had history of chronic ear infections or chronic some type of infectious process that was treated repeatedly with antibiotics from a very early age, or even kids who were given antibiotics, newborns, during the birth process, right after birth. And so what you're saying is all of those kinds of exposures really play a role in disrupting this microbiome, and it can happen pretty quickly, right? I mean, I even see like really young kids with all the evidence points to a really disrupted microbiome. We're not talking about something that necessarily happens over the course of years, right? I mean, gut microbiome can get disrupted quickly.
Absolutely. It is an ecology like your garden would be. If you had a nice garden teeming with a bunch of good plants, imagine all of a sudden you went in there and threw a huge bucket of anti-plant toxin in there. Those plants would die literally overnight. Studies show that a single dose of augmentin, a 600 milligram single dose augmentin knocks down all of the bacteria in your gut by 99%. And they start to bounce back after about 8 to 12 hours, but they come back in different ratios that they were in before. And then multiple rounds of that really ends up skewing your ecology quite a bit. The Z-Pack, which is very popular for sinus infections and all that, it takes your gut almost a year to recover from a Z-Pack. To a 10-day course of clindamycin, which is very commonly used for upper respiratory infections and so on, it takes your body up to 2 years to recover from it. And then imagine if you have multiple courses of that over a relatively short amount of time, you're really devastating that ecology. On top of that, our foods are full of Roundup and all these herbicides that have been shown to kill good bacteria. So yeah, we have built ourselves through the process of evolution in a particular way, and we've put ourselves in what could possibly be the worst possible environment for how we are built. And so it's not surprising that all of these conditions continue to escalate and continue to increase in prevalence.
And I think where that shows up so acutely is in kids, especially younger kids, right? Because they're kind of, we talk about kids a lot as being the canary in the coal mine right now with a lot of what we've created in the world and how that's impacting our bodies and our brains. But I think, you're talking about some of these medications, it takes months or a year or 2 years for the gut microbiome to be able to bounce back. Well, we're talking about 1 and 2 and 3-year-old kids who now have been, their whole gut microbiome has been, devastated by these things. And then think about the bounce back period for that and all the important development that's going to happen along that timeline where the gut microbiome is not operating the way that it should, and therefore the brain can't function as well as it should. I mean, you really see it becomes a domino effect in a way.
Absolutely. And in fact, there was a study that was published in 2017 that was quite interesting when they looked at people in their late teens, early 20s that had significant health issues. They could trace back most of the onset of those health issues to some sort of trauma that disrupted their microbiome. And that disruption in the microbiome at that time cause a neurological change in their brain, and that cause a permanent trauma in the brain that now is manifesting itself a decade later in other forms, whether it's social anxiety disorder or eating disorders, or even physical illnesses, autoimmune diseases, and so on. So absolutely, and you see the progression in kids so clearly. The science shows that the child's microbiome becomes more like an adult microbiome right around 838 days after birth, so around 2.5 years. So that's why it's no surprise that you start to see a lot of the behavioral effects of a damaged microbiome, including ASD, showing up between 2.5 and 3 years of age. You don't see it as much in younger children, in 1.5-year-olds, or even 2-year-olds. You start to see it between 2.5 and 3 years of age, because that's the important time when those microbes are supposed to be doing their job, helping our brain develop, helping us develop the right type of social skills and so on. And that's lacking. In fact, it's interesting. People often ask me, like, well, how is it that, or why is it, we always want to know the whys. Why is it that microbes would have an impact on our social skills, right, our social behavior? Well, as it turns out, there is good evidence to support that that's beneficial for the microbes, right? They don't do things altruistically for us. They're doing things to help themselves that inevitably help us. So when microbes increase social behavior in their hosts, it actually helps spread them, because hosts end up becoming more in closer physical contact with other people in the community. You end up having higher oxytocin levels. Those oxytocin levels actually help support the metabolism of the bacteria. So they're doing all of these things to help themselves, which directly helps the host as well. So yeah, all of those things, kids are the canary in the coal mine. That's a great way to state it, because a lot of us grew up in a time where our microbiomes are a little bit better and stronger, more robust. Kids now, you look at the prevalence rate of allergies and asthma and psoriasis and eczema, and then of course mood and behavioral disorders. It is alarming, and that's screaming to us, hey, there's something really going wrong here, and it's really the microbiome.
So that all paints a helpful, if not a little bit depressing, picture of, how we've got into these kinds of problems. Let's shift gears and talk about the really amazing, hopeful, encouraging part of all of this, which is now that we understand that the gut microbiome and this balance of organisms plays such an important role, there are things we can do about it, right?
Yeah, and that's the most important message. You and I were just talking about a wonderful conference that goes on every year called Autism One. I've had the opportunity to speak there last few years, and my big message every time I show all this science and all this important stuff, but the biggest message to the parents and everyone else in the audience is that the issues that are causing the problems that you're dealing with your children or yourself are all based on an ecological dysfunction. And because it's an ecological dysfunction, we can change it. It's not based on you just have bad luck with the wrong genes, right? And so genetic dysfunctions we can't change, but ecological dysfunctions we can change. And so that's the hope, is that the vast majority of issues we are dealing with can be reversed by fixing the ecology. So yes, there's a lot of things that we can do, and that's a great thing to talk about.
Good. So let's focus on the realm of what people have probably heard of at some point, which is this idea of probiotics or macrobiotics, taking things in supplement form or food form that can help really restore this balance or strengthen the health and functioning of the gut microbiome. So let's dive into that, because you talk about it in such a helpful way.
Yeah, so probiotics are a very interesting construct. Now, what's important to note about probiotics is the original probiotics, including the vast majority of ones that people have access to in store shelves and online and all that, were all developed well before we knew anything about the gut, right? So all of this stuff we are talking about that we've learned about the gut, we've only really learned it in the last 9 or 10 years. And the vast majority of probiotics and yogurts and all that were developed decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the first probiotic was developed back in 1902 by Ilya Mechnikov, a Russian scientist. And so probiotics have been around for a long time. The idea behind the original idea behind probiotics was, here's a set of good, friendly bacteria that are beneficial. Let's take them in really high doses. They'll go in, live in your gut, and because they are there, they will conduct all of these functions that are good for you. Now, as we start to learn about the microbiome, that becomes a bit of a problem, that whole thinking. The reason for that is every individual has a completely different microbiome, right? If you and I did a genetic test on our chromosomal DNA, we would show 99 or 99.5% similarity in our DNA. We're both humans. A few differences in our genetics is the stuff that makes you a woman, makes me a man, gives you light color hair, gives me dark color hair, and so on. But if we were to take a look at our microbiome, we would be as little as 25 or 30% similar.
Wow.
We could be 70, 80% different, right? The most unique thing about us is our microbiome. I did studies on identical twins who have 100% the same genetics, came from the same mom. They could have up to 50% differences in their microbiome.
Wow.
Especially on genetic twins, identical twins, where there's one twin that's obese and the other twin that's lean. They've done a significant amount of studies on those types of twins to see that the only difference between the two is the types of bacteria they have in their gut. One has types of bacteria that makes them more obese, the other one makes them more lean. So at the end of the day, the idea is that everyone's microbiome is different. And so how do we know what type of probiotic to use that is right for you or right for me? What am I missing in my microbiome that's causing me to have these issues? What are you missing that's causing you to have issues? Or what do you have that's causing you to have all these benefits, right? So those things we can't know. We don't have the technology to know that right now. And so when you look at the decades worth of microbiome research, there really are a couple of themes that come out that are uniform across most studies. And that is that diversity in the microbiome is really important. Your diversity might look differently than my diversity, but nonetheless, there's a measure of diversity for both of us within the microbiome. And the way you measure diversity is the richness of your microbiome, meaning how many different types of organisms. The second part is the uniformity of those organisms. You know, how uniform are they? Because you could have a lot of different organisms, but 4 or 5 of them are predominant. They're the main growers, and so the other ones are at such low levels they're not really adding to the foray. And then the richness and the diversity. Now the second part is the presence of certain keystone strains. These are really important strains that most of us have in our microbiome that are baseline strains that are protective to the host, like Akkermansia and Faecalibacteria, Bifidolongum. These are really important keystone strains. So if we all have high diversity and high keystone strains, we typically have a healthy microbiome. Now, the old idea of probiotics, the products that have a whole bunch of lactone bifido strains in them, in a capsule or a yogurt, they don't affect the diversity and they don't affect the keystone strains. In fact, most of them die through the stomach. Those strains aren't designed to survive through the gastric system. So what we were looking at for probiotics is, how did our ancestors maintain high diversity? How did they maintain high keystone strains? Of course, they didn't have all of the stuff that kills bacteria, but we figured that there were microbes in the environment that they came in contact with that help orchestrate this balance within the microbiome. Right? Someone is in there with the checks and balances so that one microbe just doesn't take over and starts to proliferate. And so as we dug into it more, we found that there are certain types of environmental bacteria that humans have been exposed to for long periods of time, for millions of years through the course of human evolution. But we stopped getting exposure to them over the last 30, 40 years because we live in concrete, sterile environments. We're no longer in the environment like we evolved to be. So that's what we focus on probiotics, is these bacillus endospores that are outside in the natural environment. They're also a natural part of your gut bacteria, and their whole job is to come in and orchestrate that balance. You know, we just submitted a paper for publication that shows that in little as 3 weeks, adding in these spores can almost double the diversity of your microbiome.
Wow.
Which is mind-boggling. Right?
Yeah.
Nothing has been shown to be able to do that.
Right.
imagine a couple of strains can go in and increase the diversity of your microbiome by 600-700 other species. You know, and then the question is, well, where do those species come from? Well, they were always there, but their numbers were so low that we couldn't even detect them. These strains come in, they suppress the overgrown strains, and they produce compounds and nutrients to regrow the strains that are really suffering. Now, the other thing we also saw is a significant increase in those protective keystone strains. The Akkermansias and the Faecalibacterias, we're seeing a 10 to 100-fold increase in those particular strains. And when you have all of that type of modulation going on in the microbiome, you start to resolve the baseline defect that most people have in the Western world because of the toxicity we live in.
Such powerful stuff, and such a just really amazing way of looking at it. You know, when we think about using just like the regular probiotics, which, you know, as you noted, some people do have improvement with those and some people don't. And it's sort of like, I think about what you're talking about here as really like a Band-Aid versus root level approach to rebalancing the microbiome. Typical probiotics, we're putting them in and hoping that by just continuing to put bigger numbers of a few strains in, it will help, which may, you know, for some people. But what you're talking about with this spore-based approach is really reconstructing the environment in the gut, like creating this environment where the good bacteria can thrive, where the balance, the ecology of it can come back to where it needs to be. It's really a very different approach or way of thinking about treating the gut microbiome issues.
Yeah, you know, and it was really when we looked at it, we really took a simplistic approach to it. You know, I always joke that we are just smart enough to understand that nature has already done all the work for us. We just have to be smart enough to look for it in nature, right? Yeah. And so a lot of the probiotics on the market today, they're trying to reinvent the wheel. So the lacto and bifido strains that are used in probiotics, the whole idea of them was to try to mimic that initial seeding process that occurred when we were first born. But we can't be reborn that way again. You can't reseed the gut that way. And so when we looked at it, we said, okay, where did our ancestors get their probiotics, right? They didn't have these special refrigerated products in a store, and they didn't put stuff in special capsules and all that stuff. You know, they got it from the environment. Our ancestors, for the vast majority of human existence, ate dirt. And they accidentally ate dirt, but they didn't sterilize their environment. And as it turns out, there are some organisms in the environment that play this really important policing role in our microbiome. And here's what's really interesting about it, is we can't do that for ourselves. We cannot police our own microbiome. It's a completely separate entity that is on its own. We don't have a system in place in our own body to go, this bacteria is too high, let's bring it down. This one's too low, let's bring it up. We don't have a mechanism in our body to seal up our leakiness in our gut. We don't have a mechanism in our body to regrow those really important keystone strains. We have outsourced all of that to organisms that we are supposed to encounter in the environment. Because again, we are a walking, talking rainforest. We are in constant osmosis with the outside world, and we're supposed to be that way. You know, so it was a different approach, and what we were looking at is exactly as you said, is it's a fundamental restructuring of the microbiome. That's the only way you're gonna get real sustainable results, because even for some of those few people that get benefits from some of those products on the market, the problem is the moment you stop taking those products, the benefit goes away. Yeah. You know, and you don't really have any big global changes. Yeah. And our whole goal was, how do we make those big global changes so that you're not only affecting the behavior, but then you're affecting their allergies in some positive way. You're affecting their food sensitivities. You're improving the digestion, their growth levels. All of that stuff improves when you just start fixing those fundamental issues in the gut. You know, I'll tell you, what you mentioned as part of my bio, we're doing a lot of studies. We're up to 13 clinical trials now. We finished a study recently on triglycerides, on reducing elevated triglycerides using a probiotic. We finished a study on dermatology, on reducing acne lesions, on using an oral probiotic and reducing wrinkle appearance. reducing inflammatory markers in the skin. We're doing a gingivitis study on reducing gingivitis in the gums. We finished a study on leaky gut. We're doing one on rheumatoid arthritis. All of these things that are seemingly unconnected, gingivitis, rheumatoid arthritis, acne, all of these things with the same product, right? Why is it that we can do all of those different studies with all of those different conditions with the same product? It's because we're fixing the fundamental problem that's driving most of those things. You know, and so that's what's really exciting about all the work that's going on right now, is we're seeing you can fundamentally fix the messed up gut environment.
And I think that's such a powerful thing to think about. Most people are used to, and even, you know, clinically I would use, you know, regular typical probiotics, and you're right, you have to keep doing that, which is fine if the person's continuing to experience benefit. But at a certain point you look at, okay, how do we need to get to a more root level here? How can we make it so that this system is working well and moving in the right direction on its own, and we're not constantly having to put organisms in order to keep it balanced? And so, you know, just clinically, we've seen such great results with using the spore-based product. I want you to just let people know where they can find out more information about that, I mean, I know you have the products that we use, you know, in clinical practice. I know you have some that are available for people to go and purchase to try this. Where can people find more information on this?
Yeah, so one of the easiest places where they can go and research, do their own work on it is come to our website at microbiomelabs.com. So microbiome is spelled the same way, M-I-C-R-O-B-I-O-M-E, and then labs with an S at the end of it, .com. On there, when we sell these particular products only through health practitioners like yourself, and those with standard brick and mortar practices. So they can come in, and there's a find a practitioner tab. They can put in their zip code, and you'll find practitioners and doctors all in your area that carry the products, and then you can talk to your doctors about getting it. There is a retail version of it as well, which has a lower dose. It's a great product for maintenance. We use it a lot in kids with behavior disorders. It's called Just Thrive Probiotic. So both of those are available for access to people. And on our website, we also have a lot of information on the product and understanding what these strains are, where they come from, and so on. And then if they ever want to go and learn a little bit more about some of these connections, if they put my name into YouTube, apparently there's lots and lots of videos that show up. I've been fortunate enough to do lots of these kind of great interviews, and then the hosts are always nice about putting them up on there. So there's a lot of information on how the spores work and so on. But you know, it's important to note that they've been in these particular types of probiotics have been in the prescription drug industry since 1952.
Wow.
You know, we weren't new in that sense. So, you know, we didn't invent them. As we were looking at what type of bacteria would be impactful and made sense from an evolutionary standpoint, we found these bacterial endospores, and then we said, okay, who's selling them? And then as it turns out, in 2/3 of the world have been using them for over 60 years to treat gut infections, upper respiratory tract infections, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We just haven't utilized them in the U.S. And so that was our role in bringing them to the U.S. and then doing the clinical research with those. So, so yeah, it's really quite exciting to see all of the different impact that making that fundamental change in the microbiome can have. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is kind of have a global benefit. You know, once you start fixing that gut, the baseline deficiencies in the gut, you start to see changes in all types of issues. You know, you're not just looking at the one issue that you're dealing with. We're looking at making a global change. And here's the important part: you're also preventing the onset and the progression of other issues that you don't have yet, because this typical dysfunctions in the gut are responsible for the vast majority of chronic illnesses, at least driving them, if not being the primary cause of them. And so even though right now you're more focused on certain behavior issues and maybe some allergies, know that, you know, those same dysfunctions down the road could manifest into autoimmune conditions and acne and all kinds of other stuff. You know, and so it's important to address this fundamental, the baseline.
Yeah, it's laying the best foundation to support health and function, not just for right now, but also into the future for ourselves and our kids, that really important foundation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
This has been such an important and valuable discussion. I know that it's got people's wheels turning of thinking about, what they need to do and want to do to address this. So thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about this. Really, really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I'm always happy to come on. Getting this kind of information to people is absolutely imperative to health and wellness, and then just kind of improving the health of society in general. We're all kind of going through this together, right? And so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about it.
Absolutely. Okay, everybody, thanks for being here, and we'll see you for our next episode of the Better Behavior Show.